So hello and thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity given to me to present to this great audience. My name is Benoit Dupont. I'm a professor of criminology at the Université de Montréal in Canada. And the title of my presentation today is Cybercrime and Government Responses in the Time of COVID. The outline of my presentation will deal with the coevolution of cybercrime and cyber threats in a time of the COVID-19 pandemic that we are currently experiencing. I will look at the coevolution of the virus, which is a biological virus, and how the digital viruses and infections have co-evolved alongside this biological virus. I will also look at how cyber criminals and cyber offenders have exploited and leveraged the current feeling of fear and uncertainty. And I will also briefly look at the government responses in 9 countries, the G7 countries, plus the Netherlands and Australia, to try to assess how effective those responses have been. And finally, I will conclude by a few thoughts on cyber resilience as maybe a substitute to cybersecurity. COVID-19, as we've discovered, has not only been a terrible public health crisis, but also has amplified a number of online risks, among which cybercrime figures prominently. Why? Because it enhanced levels of uncertainty and fear among the population, which has sought a lot of information online and sometimes in places that have been compromised by cyber criminals and cyber attackers. Also because with the lockdowns imposed by many countries, millions of workers have shifted overnight to remote work or work from home arrangements, where they have been forced to work with applications and in environments that were not necessarily very conducive to security. Thirdly, because the critical infrastructures on which we rely to deliver public health and care to sick people and to people infected by the virus have also been proven to be very fragile and very exposed to digital attacks. And finally, because the quest, the race for a vaccine has also exacerbated a number of espionage and disruptive behaviors from nation states that have actually compromised the health of our digital ecosystem. So COVID-19 is the perfect example of what my Dutch colleagues call a transboundary crisis, which is a crisis that affects multiple jurisdictions. So it's a global pandemic, undermines the functioning of various policy sectors and critical infrastructures. So for example, in the case of COVID-19, the public health institutions have been stressed and have been really tested. Digital infrastructures as well have been tested. National security has also been stressed. And of course, transport, infrastructures, accommodation, tourism, and many other policy sectors have been affected by COVID-19. A transboundary crisis is also a crisis that escalates very rapidly and morphs along the way. And there is still a lot of uncertainty about COVID-19 and what will happen next. So there is no existing model of that can predict what will happen in a few weeks or in a few months. And for all those reasons, those transboundary crises are extremely difficult to manage and very challenging for governments and even the private sector to address. So I would like to look at very briefly the ways that cyber criminals have adapted and have leveraged the COVID-19 crisis to transform their existing strategies to victimize individuals and organizations. And I will look at a handful of changes that have occurred for the past 8 months. So the first type of cybercrime that has evolved as a result of COVID-19 are online scams. They have been delivered on a constant basis since the beginning of the crisis by email, by SMS, through websites. And basically they consist in cyber criminals exploiting the need for information and protection of individuals to offer them fake vaccines, fake testing kits, fake or counterfeited protective equipment, fake travel authorizations in exchange for money. And this effectiveness of online scams is fueled by the disorganization of government communications during the early days of the pandemic and even up until now. So it's maybe too early to assess at this stage if COVID-19 generated higher profits for cyber criminals and the extent of those increased profits, but there is a certainty is that really it has enabled new types of scams at massive scales. It also has enabled cyber criminals to increase the effectiveness of the distribution of malware-enabled data theft stratagems. So this is a screen capture of a malware called Farade, which is an information stealer where cyber criminals are exploiting, again, the appetite and the need for information that people have with a title that pretends to give them some of this information on coronavirus affected company staff to convince people to click on the link and to download a malicious piece of software. And the purpose here is not to defraud people or to extort money, but more to acquire and to steal personal information that can then be repackaged and sold on underground illicit markets. In the field of fraud, a third type of fraud that was massively exploited by organized cybercrime groups is the exploitation of the financial aid programs that were launched by governments all across the world to try to salvage collapsing economies and to try to support families and businesses throughout this crisis. So the governments hastily deployed social benefit programs and business support programs, emergency programs that consisted of hundreds of billions of dollars very often, but with limited time and hence limited controls, so that it enabled cybercrime gangs to exploit these windows of opportunities and to submit fake claims on behalf of the people they had stolen the identity of. And of course, those people were doubly victimized because when they tried to claim actually those benefits for themselves, they discovered that someone had already made such claim and they had to clear their name before they were able to enjoy those benefits. So it's hard to assess at this stage, but probably at least in the US, 2 to 3% of those government programs resulted in fraudulent claims, which doesn't seem to be that much, except when you consider that those programs consisted in hundreds of billions of dollars. So the estimate is that tens of billions of dollars were defrauded in the process. Also, cyber criminals exploited COVID-19 to launch disruption campaigns under the guise of distributed denial of service attacks or ransomware attacks. And those attacks exploited the fatigue and the exhaustion of personnel working in critical infrastructures and at home, but in particular at hospitals and research labs and we heard a lot of horror stories about that. And they also exploited the sense of urgency that was attached to the work of critical infrastructures and public health institutions. And as an example, a university in California paid a $1 million ransom because otherwise it would have lost the research it was doing on a potential COVID-19 vaccine. So a lot of malware disruptions occurred as a result, exploiting, again, the uncertainty and the exhaustion and the fatigue of internet users. Also, in the same kind of configuration, millions of people started to work from home overnight, increasing the number of devices connecting to corporate systems from outside of the protected areas, accessing corporate data over consumer networks. Users also working from home were a lot more distracted because very often their family was holed up with them in the same dwelling, received very limited security support, had to work using applications they were not familiar with and for which they hadn't received any kind of security training. So overall, we saw a decrease in the effectiveness of security controls, and that resulted in a number of attacks and higher rates of infections, of digital infections. Finally, cyber criminals were very opportunistic and exploited also the launch of contact tracing apps developed by governments to try to digitalize the contact tracing operations to slow down the spread of the virus. And for example, in Canada, and this is a screen capture from Canada, cyber criminals set up fake websites pretending to come from Health Canada and made available fake apps only 6 days after the government of Canada announced it was going to produce, design, and deliver a contact tracing app. So you see the fast speed at which cyber criminals are able to leverage government initiatives to convince people to download malicious software and to access privileged information. So if we try to map all those online risks, we see that there are three main categories of malicious actors that were involved. Cyber criminals driven by the need to generate financial profits, government hackers trying to launch espionage operations to appropriate intellectual property, and state-sponsored hackers coming in between, semi-autonomous from government institutions. Basically, they launched into three different kinds of objectives: to defraud victims, to steal data, to resell those personal informations, and to appropriate intellectual property, and also destabilize adversary governments. And in terms of victims, we see 5 different categories of victims: individuals, businesses, critical infrastructures, a specific sector of critical infrastructures, the health sector, and government systems. And what we see through this flow chart is that actually when you're a victim, you have to account for and prepare for different types of attacks and different types of risks. So you have to be prepared for a variety of risks that evolve. And we can also see that attackers sometimes launch different types of attacks. So it's not so easy to detect and to predict exactly what attackers are going to do. So there is really a cybercrime coevolution that we saw over the past 8 months. It's interesting to see that when you're mapping what cyber criminals did, they followed local developments in the pandemic and the diffusion of the pandemic. Most of the scams and online attacks we recorded started in Asia and then moved to Europe and then later on to North America. And those patterns closely reflect the spread of the virus and very quickly are able to exploit changes in the statistics of infections and the rates of infections. They also very often are able to identify the most vulnerable sectors and the most vulnerable individuals and to exploit those social or organizational vulnerabilities. And we see that they have really, cyber criminals, a very, very high level of adaptation, which is very rarely matched by public organizations in charge of defending computer systems. In terms of the timeline, you can see the spread of those frauds, the attacks against hospitals, when you see the rise in the number of people being admitted to hospitals in Europe and North America, government programs being launched very immediately, frauds start to happen, attacks again, contact tracing applications later on in the beginning of the summer, and phishing campaigns remain quite stable throughout the whole 8-month period. When we look at government responses, we mainly are able to categorize those responses in 3 categories, 3 buckets: prevention, response, and recovery. So the before, during, and after, hopefully. In terms of prevention, lots of awareness campaigns were launched on social media, providing guidance to individuals, businesses, and critical health infrastructures. But what we found is that very often they didn't have a very broad reach in the population, and they were limited in their capacity to reach large numbers of people. And in general, there was a lack of preparation that we observed, except maybe in a couple of countries such as the UK. And the prevention programs were very static. They didn't evolve as quickly as the threats and as the types of cybercrimes that were deployed. So sometimes the prevention and the awareness campaigns were somehow disconnected from the content of the scam and phishing emails that people were receiving. In terms of response, limited government capacity to support mitigation activities through such a massive crisis, limited citizen engagement to help with the detection and mitigation of threats, such as suspicious emails, except in the UK, where a system was implemented to help people declare suspicious emails and to help the authorities suppress those emails. And in terms of response, we saw important intergovernmental partnerships with, for example, the Five Eyes countries and European Union countries, public-private partnerships, not so great partnerships between the national and the local governments in those 9 countries that we studied. And finally, in terms of recovery, probably too early to assess. What we know is the technical resilience of the digital infrastructure, the internet, the cloud, was quite robust. What wasn't so robust is the capacity of the critical infrastructure in the health sector to deal with, for example, cyber attacks and ransomware, which in fact are quite easy to prevent and could have been prevented and mitigated much more easily. So it leads me to conclude that by saying that cyber resilience, which is the capacity to limit the impact of cyber disruption and to restore normal operations following a cyber incident and to adapt to a new threat landscape, is not so developed. We only witnessed a handful of countries that seem to have developed some good cyber resilience. In the UK, we saw a very nimble communication strategy to adapt to the new threat landscape, relying on new social media platform. In Australia, massive investments pledged over 10 years to enhance the level of preparedness. In Canada, it's not on my slide, but some interesting new partnerships between academic research labs and intelligence agencies to try to better help those research labs protect against cyber attacks. But overall, I think we're still lagging behind in terms of cyber resilience. And I think it's one of the lessons probably of this crisis. We need to maybe recognize that cybersecurity is probably not enough, and we need to really adopt a more cyber resilient posture or approach, which is more focused on the future and tries to develop the capacities to operate in very highly uncertain environment. I'm going to stop here because I want to leave some time for Q&As. But if you'd like to contact me or to reach out to me or to download some of my papers, feel free to email me or to visit this website. Thank you very much for the quality of your attention.